The lore coming out pertaining to what's going on with the Vigilus campaign in Warhammer 40,000's 8th edition truly has the galaxy in flames. The current events have the Imperium split in half, with the Imperium Nihilus separated by a massive warp stone. But this really isn't the first time the Imperium has dealt with this, and it certainly won't be the last. And I wanted to take some time to talk about the Imperium as a whole. So this miniseries is aimed at discussing the very origins of the Imperium, how we went from the Terra-bound Age of Terra to the Age of the Dark Imperium that we are currently in. Much of what we know is from far older and far darker portions of the lore, when building the world of the Imperium was essential to understanding the enemies of the current Imperium. With shadows from the past, such as the Men of Iron, returning to us in the Blackstone Fortress, this is a great time to really learn what makes the Imperium, well, the Imperium. And this won't span all the way back to the creation of the Star Gods, the birth of the Old Ones, and the subsequent War in Heavens. We'll save that for a different series. But today, join me as we discover the secrets of our sci-fi seniors. And everything really starts with the Age of Terra, or the Age of Progress as it is otherwise known. And this is the era that we as 21st century living humans can easily relate to, as it is the now, it is the here. Everything before this point, and up to the point we accomplish space travel, is the Age of Terra, so the birth of humanity up to that point. And in Warhammer 40,000 terms, we started to colonize and expand outside of Earth using sublight travel and cryogenics as we expand further and further from the Sol system in an act known as the Stellar Exodus. And this started around the mid to late 3rd millennium, and we'll start to use the imperial calendar from now on, so that's M3 in the beginning of our Stellar Exodus. And the early human civilizations were more akin to the Galactic Federation of Star Trek. I guess that's probably a pretty good parallel there. Explorers, colonists, and scientists. There isn't a ton of information around this time, and it's generally more hearsay rather than written chronicles of the mighty deeds or the acts of the era. And it seems to be a rather benign and innocent age of exploration where humans are kind of fumbling through the galaxy with the yakety sax music playing while they careen from world to world. And this went on until the Dark Age of Technology started in sometime between M15 and M18. But before we dive in on this, let's highlight the name, as it is quite the misnomer. We think of our own Dark Age as a time that was, overly popularized by pop culture as a barbaric time where humans forgot the use of tourniquets and didn't bathe, when in truth that wasn't true. The Roman tradition of bathhouses extended well into the Dark Ages of Europe. Well, we get a similar treatment with Warhammer. The Dark Age of Technology is, in fact, not an age of ignorance and chaos, but rather a time of rampant growth, technological advancement, really the apex of humanity. And it was truly the nascent Imperium's Pax Imperialis, or something like that, and Pax Imperio, I can't remember which one the actual definition would be. But it was because of the following Age of Strife and Age of Imperium that slapped dark in front of the Age of Technology, as the mankind kind of grew to abhor science, the very same science that the Age of Technology idolized and revered. So moving back to M18 or so, we have the birth of the warp drive and the creation of the Geller field. Both devices allow for ships to finally make small, short-distance warp jumps. Now these are calculated warp jumps, going around 4 or 5 light years in distance. They involve rudimentary abacuses, a T85 or TI-85 calculator loaded with Snake, and of course, a protractor. Not really. The ship's warp drive can monitor the part of the warp they're about to jump through, and all calculations are done in real space, such as the ship's projected course, corrective maneuvers, journey time, exit point, etc., all those kinds of things. They all have to be done before translation into the warp. This is called a calculated warp jump. Remember, there aren't any navigators, Astronomicon, or any other toys that we have today, so this was all very rudimentary. Now, the Geller field, on the other hand, allows for all of this to go off without issue. If it effectively projects a bubble of real space around whatever device it's calibrated for. In this case, a ship. But it can also be used on the gestation tubes for Primarchs. Hint, 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 hint. We will go into that later. One thing I kind of thought about while writing this was, who discovered that there needed to be a Geller field? Who sat there and did the first calculated jump and said, dude, I saw some crazy shit. We need something to protect us from that. Or was the first calculated jump a complete catastrophe? There's no real chronicles of that. There's nothing that says, like, humans developed the Geller field in response to their first forays into the warp, or their knowledge of the warp meant that they needed a Geller field before they even attempted it. So I don't know which came first here, the cart or the egg or the chicken on the roof, whatever the fuck the term is. But still, the Geller field is created and it is used prominently throughout the entirety of the history of man from this point forward. And these two inventions, with these two inventions, humanity explodes across the galaxy. The golden age of expansion has begun. And before faster than light travel, or FTL as I'll call it from now on, humanity has been relatively isolated. Each colony essentially remaining independent of itself, only able to trade with local colonies, if any at all. And FTL allowed for a galactic economy to appear as commerce and communication between the previously isolated pockets of humanity finally reconnected. And furthering this connection, the navigator gene was discovered and mutant navigators were created in M22. Now, I say discovered like they just stumbled across navigators. No, they created them. They were able to manipulate gene code on a very base level and created the navigator gene. There is some speculation that the Emperor had a hand in this. The Emperor exists at this point in history. He is very cloak and dagger. He's behind the scenes. He doesn't do anything. He only kind of comes out of history every so often as prominent figures to influence things here and there, but for the most part, he lives in the shadows. Going forward here now. Navigators, on the other hand now, they allow humans to see the currents and the ebbs and flows of the warp, allowing for longer, more precise warp jumps. Though calculated jumps were now only used in emergencies, as piloted jumps with the navigators at the helm took precedent to allow for jumps as far as 5,000 light years to be done. And this is all done from a navigator's third eye. Staring into the eye can drive a normal human mad, so all navigators are now required to cover their eye when not in warp transit. They use this eye to kind of peer through the warp and see these ebbs, these flows, these currents. And we have the rise of all the navigator houses and their rise to prominence as a superpower, actually. In the Dark Age of technology, they are not necessarily tethered to a Space Marine chapter or some sort of like a distant creed or promise or some sort of trade. They're actually their own unifying powers. So it's interesting to note that, because in the Dark Imperium, that is a much different situation. And when I say Dark Imperium, I mean current timeline Warhammer 40,000. It of course changes throughout history, but we'll get through that as we move through this, of course. The result of all this is a massively expanding human civilization spanning countless stars and systems. And at the time, humanity was so far advanced in their technology that it's hinted that most alien races feared them outright. Essentially, the Milky Way was ruled by the Eldar, who was still the biggest and most premier force in the galaxy at the time, then the humans. Non-aggression pacts and trade treaties existed with a multitude of alien races, creating a relative era of scientific prosperity and peace. And this is the same age where Titans are first constructed and built, massive engines of war ranging in size equivalent to small buildings to taller than vast mountain ranges. All the ships that the Imperium uses today they come from STCs, or standard template constructs, created during this Dark Age. Let's go into those too, shall we? And really, they're effectively the high-tech equivalent of a booklet that comes in a Lego set. STCs are one of the biggest defining characteristics of the Dark Age of technology, and truly the lasting legacy of the age. They're discovered as relics throughout the abandoned worlds in the present era. And these massive database systems allowed for pockets of humanity to remain technologically viable, as they were comprised of the combined scientific and technological findings of the era. And it's because of the STC system that humanity was able to expand far beyond its normal means. Colonizing a planet, they could fully utilize the STC to create ships on the local planet. And as we mentioned earlier, humans came into contact with orcs and Eldar, and so far advanced was the STC that the conflicts were minor, if not outright trivial, resulting in non-aggression pacts. Now, I'm not sure if that means that the proto-Imperium, the humanity was so far advanced in their technology that the Eldar was like, oh, okay, we're shooting mini charged shurikens and you have a big death beam cannon. Let's just call it quits here, huh? It doesn't really go into detail about that. We don't have any huge sweeping wars of the era to really kind of say that, okay, the orcs were battled into submission or anything like that. We kind of just have, again, a lot of the older lore that translates out to be this way. But as humanity grew, so did their innovations, making way for new building materials, allowing for larger and taller buildings. The first proto-hive cities start to crop up across the galaxy as planets reach their population limit many times over. And Terra is a great example of a world that is bursting at the seams with overpopulation and relying heavily on intergalactic trade to maintain its populace. Ultimately, this is a time where science is worshipped as a god by humanity. The old religions are cast off and the STC reigns supreme. And part of this supremacy was derived from the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, or, as the current Adeptus Mechanicus calls it, abominable intelligence. Now, this AI starts out with the Stone Men, which are the precursor to the Men of Iron. Now, there's a lot of talk about Men of Stone, Men of Iron, and last and more enigmatic, Men of Gold. So take what I'm about to say with a relative grain of salt before we get into the nitty-gritty of AI, Stone Men, and Strong Men as a whole. Or Strong Men, sorry. Stone Men and Iron Men. But again, take this as a grain of salt and what it really leads to. There's a single entry in the 3rd edition rulebook by Keeper Crippius about each material of man. And there's so many theories and rumors that pervade that. One is that each distinction of material is an AI with a specific intention. Gold were the teachers and educators. Stone were the artisans and builders, while the Men of Iron were equipped with waging war. Now, another theory exists wherein each material is a higher level of both rarity and complexity AI, with gold being the rarest and most complex, and iron at the bottom of the ladder. Lastly, another theory hints at the golden race, quote-unquote, being perpetuals or empire-esque figures, the stone race being humans, and the iron race being robots created by the humans. Now, I couldn't really talk about this section without bringing them up, but since the golden race only subsists on this old and ancient portion of the lore, it's hard to really expand on them further. So we don't really know a ton about them, and they're really going to just kind of die out with what we're saying right now. So this is the end of our golden race, golden men conversation. But what we do know is that the Stone Men created the Iron Men. Robert Downey Jr. is an AI, so you heard it here, folks. But really, the Stone Men were a sort of, to reuse a term here, proto-AI to the true advanced learning that became the Iron Men. The Iron Men waged war and accomplished all forms of tasks for the humans. And this is the true and absolute height of human technology at this point. You have humans as this highly advanced technocracy with almost nothing in the way of religion, and a super race of AI essentially sustaining the humans. This golden age lasts from M22 to M25. But everything starts to unravel around M23 with the beginning of the Cybernetic Revolt. Now, there's something to be said about the technology of the time. Humans seemed to be able to weave or interweave the warp into their technology, creating what we know now as machine spirits and maybe even the AI themselves. There are some theories that exist claiming that the ruinous powers might have been able to corrupt the Iron Men, as they were essentially an intelligence with its mind unguarded. And psychers started to pop up around this time as well, so demon activity began to pick up in this millennium. That would kind of add credence to that theory. And there's also a notion that the Great Void Dragon, Magladroth, the true Omnissiah, more on that later, was responsible for corrupting the Iron Men. Now, I like to describe or subscribe to the thought that the AI, being self-improving and self-aware, found humans as either a hindrance or a burden to their overall programming or their overall tasks that needed to be dealt with. This kind of like stems from my own optimistic fear of AI, but that goes into a much deeper discussion later to be had. If you don't know anything about AI, I strongly recommend looking up like the schools of thought on it. There are 4 main quadrants. You're either optimistic and you're excited for it, you're pessimistic and excited, or you're optimistic and fearful of it, or you're pessimistic and fearful of it. I fall on the optimistic, fearful side of it. So take a look at that in your off time. Back on track. The Cybernetic Revolt was a brutal era in humanity's past. A machine fought creator in a massive war that spanned the galaxy. The Men of Iron utilized massive mechanivores which could absorb planets and space-time itself as data, massive ships that could snuff out suns and absorb their energy, and lastly, microscopic nanomachines that could consume everything in a system in mere hours. So basically, Men of Iron were very similar to what we see in Necrons, but even Necrons were afraid to use such tools of destruction as it would throw off the balance of the universe. The conflict was eventually won by the humans across a massive alliance of galactic powers, both human and alien. The result was the early onset of the Age of Strife. Humanity had gone from creating AI and even titans that were powered by AI, like the Castigator Titan, to the complete revulsion of such things. Iron Men were completely destroyed, at least this was thought to be the case. In the current timeline, we see UR-025 as the first Iron Man reappearing in the lore in years, and also directly stating that he's met the real Omnissiah, hinting heavily at the Catan Magladroth. For those of you who don't know, the Adeptus Mechanicus worship the Omnissiah, which is another word for the Emperor, whereas UR-025 says, you don't know anything about the real Omnissiah, I've met him. So that's where that comes from. The Cybernetic Revolt, though, severely diminished the previously established supremacy that the Golden Age had brought about. Closing shots of the Revolt also heralding the screams of the beginning of the Age of Strife. The Dark Age of technology would come crashing down with the onset of even more and more psychers across the universe. More progressive and technologically advanced societies harbored and even helped propagate psychers. These were some of the first planets to fall, though. Demons spewed forth from possessed psychers on planets across the galaxy, destroying millions of lives. The planets that treated psychers with speculation saw themselves through the worst of these times, preventing any demon incursions via witch hunts and outright killing on them. But the colonies of the galaxy became isolated once more. Massive warp storms thundering across large swaths of the universe, cutting off entire civilizations or outright destroying them. Some pockets remained, creating pocket empires. And for those that have read the Horus Heresy, the Interrex are a great example of this. These long periods of isolation brought about the birth of abhumans, or humans that had evolved beyond their normal human selves. Ogrins developed on harsh and barren environments with high gravity, Ratlings developing on agro worlds, and Squats evolving on worlds closest to the galactic core that were high in minerals. So ogres, halflings, and dwarves respectively. Eventually, these warp storms reached the Sol System and Terra itself, cutting the cradle of humanity off from its greater self. And with this, the STC was lost almost in its entirety. Fragments and copies of copies exist that are discovered in the modern era, but the Dark Age of technology came to a short and devastating end in M25. This lines up directly with the fragmentation of the Eldar society, the birth of Slaanesh, and the creation of the Warp Rift, the Eye of Terror. Arguably, all of these events are what truly led to the end of the Dark Age of technology, as demon activity kind of peaked throughout the galaxy. But this really opens the door for our next video on the Age of Strife and the rise of the Emperor. But the Age of technology gives us a pretty great glimpse into the distant past of the Imperium. For one, the Imperium was not founded at this time, so humans were a more united force about the dogma of the Imperium of the Dark Imperial Age we're currently in. And another thing to note is the similarity of early human growth to the current technology of the Tau, a highly advanced civilization possessing technology that is seemingly endless, all working for a greater good. Even the way the Tau jump through the warp using calculated jumps is reminiscent to early humanity. Tau Empire society is even divided into caste systems: sky, earth, fire, air, and I believe air castes. And sounds pretty similar to the notion of Golden Stone and Iron Man as far as highly specialized and isolated roles within a society, doesn't it? But regardless, this is an era that brought about weapons and technology that are still used today, without the means of being replicated, of course. Things like graviton weapons, the Golden Throne, Dark Glass, Teleportariums, larger classes of Imperial naval vessels which are no longer in production, the means to create Primarchs. All of this is directly related to the Dark Age of technology. In our next video, we'll discuss what happens through the Age of Strife, the Unification Wars, and the rise of the Emperor, and as thus, the birth of the Imperium. But thanks so much for watching for joining me here today, guys. If there's any subject you'd like to expand on within the scope of these videos, please let me know. There will be things I either gloss over because they're too big to touch on without a proper video, or there's not enough lore to go into further detail. But as always, thanks so much for watching, have a good one, and take care.